Hey guys, so today I want to talk about Flutter Tongue. And since I've already made a Contemporary Techniques 101 video, which for those of you who don't know is my flute-oriented series, that means this one's for composers. And I know that this can be kind of seem like an unnecessary video because it is an older technique that's more established and more people know about it, but I think there are still a lot of things to talk about with it, particularly things that are like very specific to flute players and that composers who don't play flute might not know about. So, those of you who've been around this channel for a long time probably know what I'm going to start with, and that is the different kinds of flutter. There are two. There's the forward flutter, which is more like the Spanish R, and there's guttural flutter, which is more like the French or German R. A lot of people only know how to do one, myself included. I only do the guttural R. I speak French and Dutch, so they're kind of in my wheelhouse in that regard. And I struggle really mightily to do the forward flutter. So why does that matter in the context of a composer? Because most of the time when there's multiple ways to do a technique, it's up to the performer to pick the best one for them. I've found in a lot of repertoire, and a lot of like quote unquote established repertoire as well, the composers dictate which flutter they should use, and I don't think that's the most effective way to do that. For me, I know that I have control over my flutter enough to change the color so it sounds like I'm doing a forward flutter or a guttural flutter based on what it says. But a less experienced performer might think that they have to learn how to do both. And while it's admirable to want to learn how to do both, it's something that I definitely have tried to learn and just have not been able to. I don't think it's a necessary goal, particularly when it is quite possible to create the sounds that you need with just the one type of flutter. I will admit that like forward tongue flutter sounds brighter and a little bit more shrill, and guttural flutter is a little bit darker and warmer. It also does affect the ranges. Like tongue flutter is forward tongue flutter is much brighter and easier in the high ranges, where it's much harder in the low range. And the opposite is true with guttural flutter. That being said, that's why we practice, to be able to even out the ranges and to be able to control the colors so that when we see a piece that needs a bright flutter and we only know how to do guttural flutter, we're not stuck. So for me, and I think a lot of performers would agree with me, rather than say forward or guttural flutter, I would rather the tone color that you're going for. Do you want bright? Do you want dark? Do you want shrill, rich, warm, whatever it is? That's a better indicator of what we should be doing rather than asking us to learn new techniques, which may be not essential, not impossible, because it isn't impossible to learn these other flutters, but it is very difficult and sometimes not worth it. So when there's a very good option otherwise, why not use it? I have said in the past that it's a genetic thing. I have done research on this and I'm wrong on that. So I will admit that it is not impossible to learn this if you don't know it right now. But I've worked for the last 20 years to try to figure out how to do it, and I still can't. And while that's an anecdotal evidence proof, I do think it's fair to say that like my flutter isn't the problem of my playing, and no one seems to have a problem with the fact that I can't do the forward tongue flutter. So there's that. The next thing that I want to talk about is duration of note. Because it is a tongue motion, there's a startup quality to it. It is quite difficult to have a very, very short note speak with good flutter. I would say it depends on the performer. Some people have a quicker action, and it also does depend on the kind of flutter that you do. But the general rule that I give composers is like eighth note at quarter equals 120, and anything longer than that. And that's a general rule of thumb, I would say. Because anything like longer than an eighth note, you're gonna have a good sound. Obviously, quarter and half notes, tempo dependent, are going to be the best sounding, or just long notes in general, but you do need some kind of weight to the note for it to speak, because it's a tongue action, it's not an articulation necessarily. You can actually interject articulation over it, so it isn't the same way as like a slap tongue or a tongue ram or something where it's just like on the beat and you can immediately get that sound. Another thing to keep in mind with articulation is that articulation disrupts the action, because articulation causes you to have to stop the tongue vibrations that create the flutter tongue sound. So if you have an articulated flutter tongue passage, you're going to have to make that passage a little slower than if it were a slurred passage. For example, super fast. It's slurred. It's just an airstream thing. Whereas you can hear that it's not as smooth or as fast as the slurred passage. So that's just information to have. It's not to say like you cannot have articulated flutter tongue passages. It's just know that the articulation does disrupt the sound, and therefore it will change the way that passage interacts. The same is true with wide intervals. Because of the airstream and the pressure changes, it's a little bit easier than with articulation, but the range changes and the speed and the articulation do affect the flutter. And if that's something you want and you're going for, then cool, know that that's what you're going for. But asking for a smooth, very fast, articulated, and flutter tongue passage is a very big ask, and as always, you need to know what you're asking for. I think the moral of the Contemporary Techniques for Composers videos is like, you can do it, but you should know what you're asking, and you should know how hard it is. Other than that, I think there are some limitations in range, like dynamic range. It is quite hard to have a very soft, high flutter because of like air pressure and the technique involved. But to be perfectly honest, if you're putting quiet flutter tongue in the high range, then I question whether that's going to speak at all over the texture of an ensemble. In a solo situation, yeah, it probably will. But if you're putting it in a chamber work or bigger, I don't think that's going to speak at all. The texture of flutter tongue does kind of warm and round the sound of the flute up, and so it doesn't cut as much through a texture. It doesn't cut as much through other textures as like a true flute high note does. So that's something to keep in mind. As I said, depending on the type of flutter that the person does, they might struggle in the high range or low range, but I don't think that's a responsibility of a composer to know. That's on the performer to have practiced and have figured out how to adapt their flutter for the ranges. So I would never say to a composer like, oh no, my flutter sucks in the high range, so put it lower. Like, that's on me and that's on my performance skill. So that's not something that I would ever, as I said, put on the composer. So I think really there's only two things, but they're very big things. They're very large, like esoteric qualities about flutter tongue that I think are really worth noting when you're writing for it. And the truth is, this is one of the most approachable techniques for any performer. It's become part of our repertoire, particularly from like Les Six and the 20th century French composers. So it's definitely not something to shy away from or feel like that your performer is not going to be able to do. I think at this point it's safe to assume that the performer you're working with does know how to do flutter tongue, but there are sometimes people who are more limited, and if you're writing specifically for them, you can ask. But overall, I don't think that you should change the way you're writing for Flutter Tongue as long as you're keeping in mind the limitations of it physically. Like, I wouldn't ask the performer what kind of flutter they do. As I said, just write what you want and describe what you want and ask the performer to adapt rather than write for their flutter, if that makes sense. Because it isn't like some of the other techniques where there's a lot of physical limitations that are specific to the performer. It's more like, okay, I do this one, so I have to do these things to adapt. Whereas as some of the other ones are like, I can only do this fast, and that is all I can do. So yeah, I hope this video was helpful. As I said, I have made the like flutist how to learn how to do this technique side of things in my Contemporary 101 series, so I will link that. And as always, if you like this video, give it a like. If you're new here, subscribe, and I will see you guys next week.